stress disables our ability to make good decisions, especially chronic stress. And so then we're more likely to make poor food choices and more likely to stay up to watch TV instead of getting in bed on time and more likely to stay on the couch instead of exercising. And these are all the things, as you know well, that are correlated with higher risk for Alzheimer's disease.
Welcome to Mind What Matters. We're so happy to have you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. It seems like you guys are doing great things.
Oh, well, I really appreciate that, especially coming from you. We're trying, starting a nonprofit and a podcast in the middle of a pandemic is quite a big endeavor.
Yeah, I hear you.
Fortunately, people are at home right now. So it's actually been maybe like a little bit to our benefit. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So what led you to Portland?
So I came out here for my residency, my internal medicine training, and I just fell in love with it. I had been in Florida for my entire life prior to that. And as much as I love the ocean, you ever get the feeling you go somewhere and it's just more home than home?
Yes.
That was basically what happened.
Oh, wow. Well, that's good. I bet your parents miss you. You're far away.
They do, but they have been spending their summers out here. So in a normal-ish year, I would see them a good amount in the summertime.
Yeah. Well, let's dive right in. I'm holding a copy of your
Wonderful.
Brainwash.
Nice.
I really enjoyed reading it. I've read some of your dad's books, and I think, you had some really kind of unique takes on things, and certainly with what we do relating to cognitive decline and sort of
Mm-hmm.
how to prevent that and how to live a brain healthy lifestyle when you're young so that these things don't happen to you when you're older. Can't always prevent it, but we think we can actually, slow down some cases of Alzheimer's and dementia just with simple lifestyle changes. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about today that I thought was really kind of the most unique part of your book was something you called the Disconnection Syndrome. I'm sure you've talked a lot about this, before now, but I would just like you to explain for our listeners what that is, because I think, that could hold a lot of different meanings, especially in today's world.
Right. Well, I think like most people, my father and myself, we tried to conceptualize what was going right, but also what was going wrong in the world today. And as it relates to what was going wrong, we saw this problem, which is that here we are in the 21st century, where in theory we should be healthier and happier than ever before. We have all the basics in place. I'm not saying everyone, but I'm saying a lot of people have the basics in place. They have food to eat, they have a shelter to live in. And with that said, you would expect that with access to the basic resources, we would be healthier. And yet, in America, lifespan has gone down over the last few years. And in America, most American adults will have at least one chronic disease. And so the healthy piece there doesn't really seem to be all that great. And then when you look at happiness, you look at rates of depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions, you see that despite the fact that we have access to whatever food we want, right, on our phones, whatever social content we want on our phones, an incessant stream of media on Netflix and other streaming platforms, that we've become, in some cases, more depressed, more anxious. And certainly that hasn't gotten any better in the context of the pandemic. So that was kind of the starting point, which was, why is it that despite having the basics, we're not doing well? And what we discovered is this idea of disconnection syndrome, which is that despite all of the things in place that should keep us healthy and happy, we become disconnected from the planet, we become disconnected from each other, we become disconnected with ourselves. And then within our brains, we've seen this disconnection between a couple of regions that we can get into in a bit more detail, but that the communication between these networks of brain function has been compromised by the modern life, the modern world. And with all of these things coming together, that in many ways can be seen as leading to these outcomes: poor health, low rates of happiness. And the good thing about that is that this disconnection syndrome is something that we can reverse. We can reconnect. We can reconnect to other people, to the environment, to ourselves, and we can reconnect those parts of the brain that help us to make better decisions, help us to, in general, think clearer, help us to have empathy for other people, and help us to lead lives of health.
I think, one word you just touched on that you just hit the nail on the head was empathy. And I've actually talked about this with another guest that's come on our podcast before about the empathy problem that we have in this country in particular. I think it's growing across the world, but it's almost as if people, even though social media and everything like that should bring us together, it's seemingly making us just more polarized. I don't think there's ever been a time, and I don't think it matters what side of the fence you're on politically, that you wouldn't agree that it's just one way all the way on the right and one way all the way on the left. And I just think that's such a beautiful paradigm, honestly, for just kind of how humanity is interacting right now.
Yeah.
It's either this way or it's that way. It's either plant-based or all meat. It's exercise or don't meditate or don't, people are just so extreme in everything they're doing. And I think that social media really plays a big part in kind of not really helping that, but undermining our choices that we make. Right? It's almost like it's making them for us. Do you agree with that?
I do. And so, talking about empathy, one of the studies we reference in our book is by Dr. Conrath, and she looks at rates of empathy decline in college students and finds that there has been a statistically significant drop off in empathy in college students. And when you look at what you just described, this polarization trend, you can see this very clearly in political polarization. And you can see these graphs where it's basically, the right and the left, and you can see how they've just gone further towards the polls over the last several decades. But you don't really need any of that data to tell you this. You can turn on the TV, you can have a conversation with somebody, and just ask them about how they feel around things like politics. And the unfortunate piece of this is that the rigidity that comes from this polarization, um, that is such a detriment to us being able to both enjoy our lives, but also to grow. The
Mhm.
more rigid we are, the harder it is for us to grow, to expand our consciousness, to develop new and healthy habits. So I see polarization as an outgrowth of rigidity. And really, what concerns me about it too is that we start associating these things with our identity. And so any sort of challenge to it becomes a challenge to ourselves. And we're no longer able to, to hold space to have what's called cognitive empathy, which is to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. Um, so this is all very problematic because it takes us away from any sort of community that enables us to grow as a society, but also takes us away from the ability to grow as individuals. At
Mhm.
a brain based level, one of the things we talk about in Brainwash is that empathy, specifically this cognitive empathy, is really an outgrowth of a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And we don't have to get too far into the neuroscience here, but the
That's this.
prefrontal cortex, yeah, it's right behind the forehead. And what's super important about this part of the brain is that it allows us to make reflective choices. If you think about an impulsive choice, it's something where you don't really think much, you just kind of react, versus a reflective choice where you weigh the pros and cons, where you sit with it for a moment and then decide what to do. And it's the same part of the brain that does that, the prefrontal cortex, that is involved in cognitive empathy, the ability to see things from another person's perspective. And what we argue for in Brainwash is that to be successful, both personally and as a member of society, you need to have a strong prefrontal cortex. You need to be able to have the ability to be reflective, and that it's the impulsive, reactive style of thinking that not only is going to compromise your ability to be healthy, but also represents an existential threat to humanity. Because if you have empathy for other people, you might say, hey, I don't want to use up all the fossil fuels because that might be bad for people in another part of the world when sea level rises over there. When you have empathy for other people, you're not thinking about dropping a nuclear warhead on another country. You can't do those things. So at a very real, large scale existential level, the empathy deficit has incredibly concerning consequences. But what's great is empathy is something we can train. It's like a muscle. And there's great research in medical establishments or medical training programs because they've seen that empathy predicts better patient doctor interactions, that patients just do better when their provider cares about them. Surprise, surprise. and that you can train providers to have more empathy. But it's also something that each of us can be doing with interventions as simple as getting nature exposure. Nature exposure gives us more empathy for the planet. It also gives us more empathy for each other. So there's a lot of kind of cool neuroscience-based interventions that can activate the empathy circuits in the brain.
I've always wanted to ask somebody in the medical field this. So, one of the biggest, well, two things. One, so there is science behind the fact that when you get older, you're more rigid in your thinking, right? Like it's harder to change your mind. You are kind of more stuck in your ways, so to speak. And, you kind of get stuck in your belief system, whatever it is, and it becomes harder to change it. Isn't that true that like something actually happens in the brain that kind of forces you to be that way a little bit more than the rest of your life?
It's a really interesting question, and I've been looking into this a lot lately. I think in certain aspects, yes, and in other ones, no. So certain traits tend to be more solid over time, and other traits might be a little bit more open to modification. But where it does seem to be concerning is as you look at rates of things like temporal discounting, which is a scientific way of saying how much do you discount the future. There are correlations between that and things like inflammation, brain degeneration. And we know that as you watch kind of the brain over the course of the lifespan, the brain loses its ability to use glucose, to use fuel as well. It kind of atrophies in many people, even in those we say are relatively healthy. And
Mhm.
specifically, you see this in the parts of the brain that are involved in our ability to engage in cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to change our minds. And so there are a lot of mechanisms that underlie what you're describing there. I don't think I'd go so far as to say, that all older people or that in general older people are more rigid in their ways. It's something that, we talk about as they seem to be more fixed. But I do think that, there are the underlying mechanisms which are linked to that type of rigidity. There are kind of a lot of ways to approach what rigidity actually means. So, from a psychological perspective or from a neuroscience type perspective, as far as the circuits that are involved in the brain. But I think the truth of it is that people become rigid at every age. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But the
Younger and younger now, right?
yeah, I mean, it's one of these things that has a safety mechanism. If you're adopting a rigid perspective, it gives you all of the answers. So if you decide you're a keto person now or a carnivore person, you say, I'm now carnivore. Carnivore is the solution to everything. All the other diets are terrible. And that is rigidity, but it provides you with the comfort that you have the answers. Now, the concerning thing is when you have
Kind of
voices in the
team you can join almost, right? Like
it's a
I'm
team,
a
it's an
part of
identity.
something. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I'm not trying to detract from the carnivore diet. I think in certain cases that might be helpful. But what is challenging to do, but what is ideally the right way forward is to say, this will have its pros and cons. And I need to be open to new information as it comes out. So, I had an interesting conversation the other day with Dean Sherzai, who is a neurologist out in California, and he's a pretty big proponent of the plant-based diet for brain health. Um, and he was really on the total plant-based and whole foods only, and really not trying to do anything even as it relates to eating fats, oils. But he was describing how he and his wife Aisha Sherzai had reviewed the literature on olive oil, and based on that they had changed their minds recently and had now started to incorporate more olive oil in their diet and also recommending it more to their patients. And that is the type of thing that sounds so superficially trivial, which is, of course, olive oil is good, right? Why wouldn't they change their minds? But to be somebody who has relatively, a lot of expertise in a certain area of nutrition, and then changes their mind about it is a big deal. And so, I'm sure your listeners will have heard about lots of people within the health space, nutrition influencers. I think it's just important that as we look to these experts for advice, we look to make sure that they are open to updating their priors, to changing their minds. Otherwise, we're basically just getting stuck in that spiral of rigidity, but just with the quote experts as those who guide us to it. So Definitely the rigidity piece is key as it relates to our health, but I think also to our mental health. So you look at anxiety, depression, these are cognitive states characterized by increased rigidity. So increased rigidity around pessimism, increased rigidity around future concerns.
Mhm.
And across the board, this is something that I think is a detriment to our health and really to our society.
It totally is. And, I don't mean to keep dwelling on this empathy thing, but, this is really kind of weird. My mom has early onset Alzheimer's, and that's kind of what led me into this entire arena and to do what I do. But do you know the first thing that I noticed about her? And this was probably 2 years or more before any memory loss had happened. Her empathy was gone.
Mm,
She could, I remember one time specifically, we were like leaving to go visit my grandmother, and I was super, super close to her. This was my father's mom, not my mom's, but I
mhm.
just had a baby and we took her down to meet her, and she was really quite old. And I was really tearful when we were leaving, just thinking it could be the last time that I saw her. And the whole ride back, I mean, my mom was just stone faced, like not saying like, oh, honey, it's okay, or, you'll see her again. I mean, there was no comforting. And this was my mom and somebody who, my whole life has been unbelievably empathetic and warm. I think that's really interesting that maybe that part of the brain, like what you were talking about, that frontal cortex was breaking down before, any signs of Alzheimer's were really there. I just think that's really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a powerful observation, and certainly a challenging thing because we think about empathy, the ability to care for and feel others' concerns, as one of the things that kind of defines a person's personality. And you know, what I think is interesting too is it's not just that the parts of the brain involved in empathy, like the prefrontal cortex, are involved more so in Alzheimer's, which they kind of are, but looking at how these other mechanisms might play a role. So, for example, we know that sleep issues are correlated with an increased rate of developing Alzheimer's disease, and there are several mechanisms that might be at play there as far as clearing out metabolic waste and other reasons like amyloid. But there's interesting research being done as far as what sleep does for our empathy, for basically our emotional regulation and such. And so, if a person doesn't get good sleep, they tend to be more emotionally reactive the next day. And over the years, not getting good sleep may have multiple negative effects on brain function, one of which is to kind of damage the empathy type circuits, both by way of, not resetting the emotional thermostat each night and by way of leading to a buildup of inflammatory proteins that over time can damage the physical makeup of the brain. But what I think is relevant for us to be considering here is that we like to consider that something like empathy or something like reactivity, let's say emotional reactivity, that these are stable traits for a person and there's nothing that we can do about them. But it turns out that these things are always in flux based on our environment, based on the food we eat, based on the sleep we do or do not get, our exercise. So for people listening to this who are thinking to themselves, the emotional piece is what I'd like to work on, whether that's having more empathy or being less emotionally reactive, there are a lot of lifestyle interventions that you can use that will help set up your brain to better process that kind of emotional charge, both by transferring it into a more constructive type of empathy, what we call compassionate empathy, and by calming down the emotional reactivity that can lead to actually the opposite of empathy, which is being reactive towards other people, yelling at others, being mean towards others, and in some cases, more of the narcissistic type tendencies, which is it's all about me, I don't care about you. So these are things that we can influence through our day to day routines such that our brains become more kind of set up for the right range of emotional thermostat as well as our emotional actions.
Right, and it's so easy to see, just it's so easy to see it play out in just the last 12 months of kind of the environment that the world has gone through. I mean, let's take something as simple as a mask. I mean, you have a whole host of people that are just like, well, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't care if it hurts somebody else. This is just my choice, right? And I mean, really, I don't know if that meets the definition of narcissistic, but it's pretty
It's
close.
it's yeah, it's hard to argue that that is an empathy move. And to be fair, it's not like there is comprehensive research suggesting that masks are the be all end all. But the argument that I see so many people saying is government can't force me to do this thing. I don't want to wear a mask and I'm just not going to do it. And I think, you know, what the data suggests is that there is a benefit to wearing a mask as far as spreading the virus to other people. And you know, it, it is weighing the options there. It's saying how big of a deal is it really to put this
Yeah.
on if I'm going to help a couple of other people.
Right.
So I think that there's a lot that can be pulled out of the last year as far as examples of what this manifests as, this the brain changes manifest as, and to take that a step further, the stress pathways are absolutely critical in determining how our brains are going to function. So stuff that I'm sure you know very well, chronic stress correlates with atrophy of the prefrontal cortex, but also the hippocampus. And so that's thought to be one of the mechanisms through which stress correlates with Alzheimer's disease because the
Why?
hippocampus
Can
gets
you, like,
damaged.
actually break that down? Like, what
Yeah.
is it about stress that breaks down the brain? Like, I've never actually asked someone that question before, but how does it physically happen?
So you think about what the brain does and how the brain is set up. It's actually really smart, the brain, as far as what it does. And what it does is tries to adapt so that you can stay in the game, so that you can have your genes be transferred on and ideally not die. But the brain isn't set up for you to be happy. Like it doesn't really care, if you
Really?
have a great quality of life as far as the time that you're on this planet. And why that's important is because from an evolutionary perspective, if your brain had to choose between staying alive and being happy, it's going to choose staying alive. Is an indicator, it's kind of our experience of the concern for a threat, right? That's basically what it is. It's the brain interpreting whatever's happening in your environment as a threat. Over time, they change the brain structure to make the brain more active, more kind of reactive to stressors because
Racing thoughts.
the brain will change as a result of the environmental input based on what it thinks is best. So if your brain is constantly thinking, I'm under threat, I am under duress, it's going to rev up the circuits that make you more reactive to stress because it knows that you need to pay attention to this because there's still an imminent threat. Years gone by, the person who had their threat system ramped up was going to be the one that heard the cave bear when it crawled back into their home and survive. These days, though, you basically have this chronic stress that leads to changes in your brain architecture and your connectivity that causes you to then experience more chronic stress, more anxiety. So it's really maladaptive. And it's thought that the levels of these neurotransmitters and hormones, things like cortisol, over the long term can actually damage themselves the various parts of the brain that are involved in higher level thinking. So the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, and also the hippocampus, as I said before, they seem to atrophy as a toxic result of the elevated levels of stress hormones over time. So that's one of the reasons, there are many. Another one is that stress blunts neuroplasticity, which
Mm.
is basically the brain's ability to properly change. Potentially even blunts neurogenesis, which is the brain's ability to grow new neurons. And over the long run, that then correlates with kind of this pattern we see of stress related mental health issues, cognitive issues, and then in some cases maybe even dementia. So it's a compounding effect over time that switches our brain neurotransmitters, neurochemistry, and also the neuroanatomy to a situation that is really disadvantageous for us. And what we talk about in brainwash specifically is that stress disables our ability to make good decisions, especially chronic stress. It literally breaks down the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the parts of the brain that are more impulsive, such that we rely more on those impulsive circuits. And so then we're more likely to make poor food choices, and more likely to stay up to watch TV instead of getting in bed on time, and more likely to stay on the couch instead of exercising. And these are all the things, as you know well, that are correlated with higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. You can get, you can start setting up your brain for success through any of these interventions, whatever that, we can go through all of the ones that are evidence based.
I think you should do that. I
Okay.
really want you to take us through. So again, this is your book, Brainwash, but in it, you literally come up with, you call it a digital detox.
Sure.
Really, it could just be like detox your life, I think. I mean, it's like what, 10 steps of basically cleaning out your life, and sort of figuring out how to take back control of this thinking and this way of acting that has become unhelpful and unhealthy. And one thing I do want you to keep in mind when you're talking about these steps is, we do focus like heavily on Alzheimer's caregivers for our nonprofit. And, what would you say in terms of this, like trying to clean up your brain, in terms of like knowing that these people are going through everyday trauma that doesn't change, I mean, I think that's one of the hardest parts for Alzheimer's caregivers is that, in a lot of different diseases or traumatic things that happen in families, there's a pretty quick beginning and middle and end
Hmm.
to that traumatic event. And in Alzheimer's, it can go on a decade or even more that you're
Right.
living in this constant fight or flight. I mean, you hit the nail on the head when you said that. When I was caring for my mom, the first 3, 4 years, they're just sad. They're like, this person isn't the person that they were, but they're still here and I'm going to try and enjoy them, but it's still sad. And then you kind of move into like this more immediate phase of like, okay, they need a lot of help and they might be resentful of that help. And so they're like, combative with you. And then, you have the end stages, which is just physically tolling and demanding and sad in its own right. So how do you go about this? I guess the right way to phrase it would be, how do you take control back over your thoughts and try and build up your mental health in the midst of trauma like this every day?
Yeah. So I think this is such a challenging question to answer, but it's such an important one. And, I would just say we talked about empathy a lot. And one of the things that you actually see in people who are caregivers is what's called compassion fatigue, which is basically you have too much empathy. And it's a little more nuanced than that. But, appreciating that a lot of people are in this situation because they care a lot about other people and they're trying to be there for them. And over time, that does take a toll. And, there's research suggesting that too much of that may lead to high inflammation and other, chronic stressors. Um, I will say, from my experience with my grandfather, my dad's dad, who had Alzheimer's disease, I think you characterize these phases so well. And it was, I wasn't his primary caregiver by any stretch, but just seeing the toll that that took on the people who, his sons and daughters, and when they would come and try to be there for him, and he would kind of be present, and then, as you said, maybe more combative and wanting to spend that quality time. Um, so I won't pretend to be able to tell you guys, people who are caregivers, that I have the solutions for you. I think that that is, I so commend people who are doing that because it's a really, really challenging job. But I think that trying to look after your brain health as much as possible is kind of the key. And it may not mean anything like perfection. Um, but I do think, when you look at the research as far as the things that set your brain up for success, there are enough of those things available that you can experiment within them and find those that you can adapt to your life. So, um, it's, I think, also trying not to allow your brain to tap out from the stress of your day to day into things that make things worse. So it may be that your day of care was really stressful. The goal then is to convert that into something like exercise if you are feeling really stressed, and not, eating a bunch of junk food and binge watching TV, which, I'll be honest, when I was in my medical training and was very stressed, it was much easier to make poor decisions afterwards. Your brain, your body wants to cope. Um, so I think what's really important here is trying to design your day ahead of time so that you don't have to exert your mental effort to try to get yourself to do something healthy. Instead, what you want to do is set it up such that the healthy option is the default option. So, what I mean by that is if you find yourself having a stressful day at work and you find yourself after work pulling into a fast food restaurant and eating whatever it might be to feel better, then you need to plan that that is going to probably happen tomorrow, the next day, whatever, and make changes to the routine to make that less likely. So that might mean packing yourself a healthy meal the night ahead of time. That might mean taking a different route home from work so you don't go by that fast food restaurant. That might mean calling somebody, a friend or family member, and getting them on board with a plan for trying to change your dietary habits where you start having dinner with them or at least check in with them about the healthy meal you had. Um, but I think really key here is planning for your future self so that you don't go into the unhealthy additional habits that so many of us use as a result of the stressors we experience in the course of a day. The other thing I think is important is to find ways to help mitigate the stress over the course of the day. And so that can be as simple as a breathing exercise. You know, research has consistently shown that just doing some deep breathing is a great way to reset the balance of the sympathetic nervous system, more involved in the stress response, and kind of amp up the parasympathetic nervous system, which is more involved in relaxation.
Mhm.
The other thing I would recommend is that people consider the benefit of an indoor plant. So that can either be at the home of the person you're looking after or at your own home, at your office, because plants, nature in general, helps to calm down the stress response and has even been shown to have anti-inflammatory effects. So I think that it's something that is very passive. It doesn't necessarily require us to, you know, sit there and stare at that monstera or snake plant, but we get some restoration of our stress system by simply being around nature. What you could argue is our default state, right? It's only pretty recently that we've spent all of our time indoors.
Yeah.
But I think that's really the starting point. And you know, you mentioned this 10-day plan. We
Just
also talk.
I
Go
just
ahead.
interject. Don't get a fig leaf.
Italy fig.
But yeah, just don't do that because that'll stress you out more because you'll kill it.
You know, I don't want to go on a tangent here, but we have several, and it has been a journey. Spider mites and all of these other critters that, yeah,
I don't
neem oil.
I kill everything. I have like the brown thumb. I love to be outside and I love nature, but if there's a plant, I'll kill it like 100 times over. Orchids, they never last in this house.
The secret for orchids I found is you give them ice cubes. It came from my mom because the watering is the hardest point. So
Yeah,
you just put in an ice cube once a week and it slowly melts so it doesn't overwhelm it.
that's
And
it.
so far, so good.
There you go. We've just literally right there said the most important part of this podcast. One
That's the take home.
on an orchid. Okay, so yeah, I really do want you to talk about this like digital detox though. And like I'm just gonna go through every one of them and you can sort of just say like what it is quickly. Obviously,
Yep.
number one, this internet addiction. It's so bad. It's so bad. And this is important even for like not caregivers, everybody, especially your kids.
Yeah, I think if you look at how people are spending their day, they are increasingly spending it on their screens. American adults will spend 11 plus hours a day engaging with screens. We will spend 4 hours a day watching TV, 2 plus hours on social media, and a ton of time on our computers watching, other screens. So here's what I'm going to say. Even if you don't think that all of that screen time is bad for you, it comes at a cost. It's an opportunity cost. It's what we're not doing. And so if you look at the research, if you look at just human human societies over the last several thousand years, the things that are consistently promoted as good for our health are what? They're spending time with people we care about. They're getting outside. They're exercising. They're, making food and being mindful about what we're consuming. They're just being in general mindful. And when we're spending all of that time on a screen, we're not doing that. So you can get into the research as far as social media correlation with things like depression. We can talk about the fact that when you're on these platforms, you are being exposed to sensationalized negative content, revs up the stress response, and all that. But I think the bottom line is that we need to appreciate that when we're doing one thing, we're not doing something else. And when that we're not doing that something else, in the case of social media and our screens, that something else is the healthy stuff. So what we recommend in the book is, yeah, a detox, in that we recommend a bunch of steps as far as, using the certain modes on the phone that lower the amount of notifications, that you can grayscale your phone so it's not as visually appealing.
Love that
Uh,
word.
Leave your phone in the other room when you're sleeping so that you're not prompted to check it right before you go to bed and first thing when you wake up. Also, the blue light exposure is no good before you go to bed. But the tool that we developed, that I think is probably encapsulating most of the important stuff here, is called the test of time. And it's an acronym. It's TIME. T is time restricted. So like time restricted eating, you want to limit your time on digital media to a specific period of time. You can set that. I recommend you start with 20-minute intervals, a little longer if you're watching a TV show. I is for intentional, basically have a plan when you use social media or digital media so it doesn't use you. Mindful is for the M, basically be aware of how you're experiencing it. If you're watching the news and you're feeling really stressed, that is a signal. Turn it off. You're
Mm,
no longer benefiting from it.
yeah.
And then E finally is for enriching, which is basically saying when you're engaging with digital media, you want to have a net positive, a net benefit. So many times we wind up giving media our attention, we get very little back. We give media our information so they can target us with ads, we get very little back. So E means after you finish your digital media, pause, ask yourself, was this in my favor? Was it a net benefit? And if it wasn't, that's a great opportunity to go back and set some of the other criteria. So maybe T, you limit the amount of time. I, you make sure you're more intentional. M, you make sure you're more mindful. And if you start applying this consistently, you'll definitely get a better sense as to whether you're actually gaining from your digital media. And if not, how you can tweak that use so that you wind up at least closer to an equilibrium.
Yeah. It's so hard to do, I
It
mean,
is.
here I am like brain healthy living for a living. And even myself, I got an update on my phone this week that was like, your average screen time last week was 5 hours and something on your phone. And there my 13-year-old is saying, like, see, mom, like you're just as bad as
Yeah.
me. And I'm going, well, I work on my phone, but it doesn't matter. You're still just sitting there looking at this device. And he told me some staggering statistic, which is, I hope, not true. I mean, who knows what statistics are true anymore nowadays when you hear them. But he said the average person will give up 5 years of their life now on a phone.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That's so disturbing.
But again, you think about the fact that people are spending, 2, 3 hours a day just on social media. That's It's going to be, when you consider our lives, probably decades that we've spent on our screens. And it, unfortunately, it's got all of the things that make humans interested. It has the reward that keeps us checking our emails and social media for likes and comments. It has the engagement with other people. Humans love to engage with other people. It has the social kind of judgment and approval stuff. Humans are obsessed with making sure that they are considered part of the tribe. And it has the pragmatic stuff too, where you can say, oh well, I'm just checking my email to see if anybody needs me for my business ventures. So you put all of that together, it's really no wonder that we're so invested in these screens. With that said, I think that an awesome exercise is to prove to yourself how dependent you might be. And I don't mean you. I mean, I'm sure that you've done this before. It's not saying this is the Elizabeth test. I'm saying put your phone in the other room and then just see when you start feeling the itch for it. Or better yet, give yourself a day, at least one day. I'm working with my girlfriend. We're trying to do the whole weekend where you just go off social media and see how you feel about it. And I found that there are phases, that you might wake up and say, oh, I just want to check my Instagram. I just want to check my Facebook. But then it starts to fade a little bit more, and you're able to engage in other stuff that you might not have made time for. And I think you actually do have to make a big enough window to enable the conversations and stuff that would have otherwise been present. It's, if you have your phone on the dinner table, you say, oh, well, we can still have our deep conversations, but you won't. You won't, because there's always going to be that out. And I think it takes time, 20 minutes, potentially even hours, to reopen the possibility of engaging the way we used to. And so that's why I think giving it a day, at least one day of the week, where you're saying, I'm not doing social media, because I think social media is the biggest trap. And then giving yourself the opportunity to see what happens because of that will open the door to realizing how much we are invested in these devices.
I've started leaving mine in the car. So, like, when I come home from,
That's
like,
good.
activity, I literally just leave it plugged in, charging in my car, and, like, when I close that door, it's like, that's it. From 7 or 6 or whenever it is I get home from the last kid activity, it's like, no more, until tomorrow, and it's so hard sometimes, like, especially if you're waiting on an email or you really need to do something from work, but I've found that, like, I have to physically remove it from the house, otherwise, I'm gonna be too tempted.
And it sounds intense, right? What you're describing. Why would you need that? Just have some self-control. But what researchers have shown is it's not all about this self-control thing. It's the
Mhm.
real benefit of self-control is knowing yourself well enough that you can plan so that you don't need your self-control. So exactly what you just described is the key. It's knowing yourself well enough that you can say, here's what I have to do so that I don't have the itch for it inside. And I've actually was just speaking to a psychiatrist, an anxiety psychiatrist, who basically described the same thing. He says, when I get home, I want my attention to be on my kids, on my family. So I leave it outside the house. And that's really the extreme level to which I think we're having to go now, because it's so pernicious. If you have it nearby, it's not just that you're going to check it, it's that you are going to have part of your attention thinking about the phone. There
Mhm.
were an interesting series of studies we talk about in Brainwash where just having the phone present, even if it wasn't your phone, it was just like a third party's phone. They put it on a table out of sight of two people having a conversation, that the people gauge the quality of the conversation, the interaction as lower when the phone was present. It wasn't even their phone.
I
Our
believe it.
brains, it just, it's to the point where, unless you're making an active intervention to kind of stem your use, you are going to miss out on a lot of the more important interactions. And I'm not saying that I've figured this out either. I think it's really challenging, especially right now when people are so isolated. But unless you start doing something about it, you're basically allowing your attention to be taken by, a couple of these bigger companies.
I just think, going full circle, there was a question that my daughter had asked me just a few nights ago, putting her to bed. She's like, gosh, what was it like before phones, like when you were growing up? And she was saying, like, that's so antiquated, just what did you do without it? And she's like, I can't imagine what it'll be like when I'm old one day and like I'm a mom. Loved that, by the way, being called old as a mom. But anyway, I was thinking about it and I was like, wow, what is it going to be like when you're old? And I said, if so much has been taken away, there was like a book we were reading where they were still pioneers or something, like Little House on the Prairie, like the original
Hmm.
books. She's like, I mean, people had to build their own homes and they had to do all this stuff. I was like, yeah, sweetie, like nothing was easy for people back then, but now everything is easy, right? And yet people before, I think generally we're much happier than they are now. And we still get like, we have to do some things still, but like for the most part, life is pretty easy. But you take this 20, 30 years down the road. I mean, are we all just going to be robots like lying there where, some machine comes to our body and we don't even have to work out? It just like moves us and like stimulates our muscles or something. Like, can you imagine how
Yeah,
miserable
like
people will be?
basically the plot of Wall-E. But provided the singularity doesn't happen and that we develop AI and are completely extinct in a couple of decades, I think we're going to find ourselves. We won't have as many real memories, and we'll just be relying on this thousands and thousands of photographs that we can show other people. It'll be saying, "Oh, well, this one time I went to blank and look, here are all the pictures. Oh, what did you enjoy about it? Oh, I don't know, but look at the pictures." And I think that is kind of the concern, is that there's we're distracting ourselves from the actual moments that are going to provide us the quality in our lives, and we're pretending that we can store that quality for a later date if we get the right photos. I mean, there's another thing to be said as far as distorting reality so we can look good on social media, but I think just so many of us now are taking these endless streams of photographs and we're not as present in the actual moment itself. So maybe the future will be VR and we can just continue to have these incredible experiences, but not actually be in the places where we would have otherwise. I mean, we'll see. But it's such an interesting conversation because it does get to the question of like what is the enjoyment that we get out of life? What are the things that bring us that deeper pleasure? And it does seem like the overall shift has been towards the instant gratification model of I need, not only to be watching TV, but I want to be on my phone on social media while I'm watching TV because I can't just enjoy binge watching this show. I have to do that while I'm here. And even then, you might be doing something else. You might be checking something on your computer. So I think that no one knows exactly where we'll be in a few decades, but it's hard to imagine that the overall quality of life will go up as a result of spending all this time on our devices instead of
It,
engaging with people in the real world.
there's just no way. There's no substitute for just true human connection, in my opinion. But more on that. There's not really a great human connection anymore when the empathy goes away and people are just combative and it's, well, I feel this way and I feel this way. Well, I guess I'm not gonna be friends with you anymore. Bye. It's such a hard paradigm that our world has shifted to, but it certainly explains why the rates of anxiety and depression are so high. And after your great explanation, that explains why Alzheimer's and dementia rates are increasing, threefold. I mean, the rates are expected to triple in the next 30 years. Um,
Yeah, I think it's supposed to go from around 6 million in the United States now to around 14 million by 2050. So, yeah.
Gosh, well, Austin, thank you so much for spending so much time with us this morning. I know that you're very busy. To all of our listeners, we're going to put all the information on how you can get brainwash below, and you can read all about it on our Instagram too. But it's a great book. It honestly, there's a lot of information out there for people who are looking to make small changes to their life, particularly if you've recently gotten diagnosed with something like cancer or Alzheimer's or another condition, but a lot of them are very overwhelming, I think. And what I like
Hmm.
about you and your dad's book is that it just is very simple, basic steps. And you even have like what, 50 pages of great recipes in the back, for just even on, and we've done certainly, Mind What Matters has done lots on healthy cooking and the brain healthy lifestyle, but these are easy ones. If you've done nothing but make lasagna your whole life and fried chicken, this is like a simple book. I mean, none of the recipes are complicated. And they're just very basic, small changes that you can pull out of your diet, this unhealthy oil and replace it with this. So I commend you guys for really making something that is just not terribly scientific, especially with two doctors. I was expecting lots more
Oh,
medical.
you should have seen the first version.
Well, there are a lot of notes. I did see all the
Yeah.
notes, but I just think it's a great book, and you guys should be really proud. And I can't wait to meet your dad at some point too.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, so much for having me. And I was laughing at the end of our last segment there, right as I described all these terrible things about the world. And the reason was I don't want to leave people with the sense that there's nothing they can do, that things are all terrible. And as you mentioned, as it relates to the book, there are so many simple things
Yeah.
that each of us can start doing. This isn't the quick fix mentality. I think it's the quick fix mentality that has gotten us to this point. Instead, it's a question of finding the things that you enjoy that you can stick to and that over the years are going to have a protective effect on your body, but
Mhm.
also your brain function. And it may be as simple as just finding a recipe or two that you can substitute for something that is more inflammatory. So I think, anybody can start making changes to their brain function for the better at any point in their life. That's what I believe. But the best time to be doing that is early on. You
And you're
know, we don't see the iceberg below, and then all of a sudden the tip of it pops up under this, from the surface. That's the stuff we need to be working on decades before any sort of diagnosis of
love
Alzheimer's
that
disease.
analogy. I've never heard that before, but that's really what it is. It's the iceberg below.
Yeah. So
That's
I would just, it's the food, it's the exercise, it's the sleep. Find the basics and try not to let yourself be thrown off by those people saying this pill or whatever else is going to fix everything, because this is consumerism, right? It's always the next big fix. And the truth is, we have so many of the answers already. It's just a question of getting ourselves to do it. And so I think it requires breaking from the conventional mentality of, you're going to live your life the way you see fit. And then at some point in the distant future, be blindsided by a diagnosis of chronic disease. We have to be moving away from that. And I think it's all about taking agency and really saying, I want to protect my brain now and in the future. And we have those tools.
Austin, do you take any supplements yourself?
I do. I take omega 3s and I take vitamin D. And sometimes when I remember, because it's not my priority, I take a multivitamin.
Okay. What about turmeric?
Um, I use turmeric as a spice in my cooking.
Okay. So you do get it in there somehow.
I do. Yeah. I for the most part, I am trying to do the most I can with food as opposed to with supplements. I'm not saying that, supplements aren't good, but as you know, there's supplements for a reason.
Yeah.
And
Better to get the real deal.
yeah, so as much as I can eat foods that have the spices added or, like salmon as opposed to taking fish oil, I will. And then because I live here in the winter in the Pacific Northwest, the vitamin D is unfortunately not really something I can get in the real world.
That's okay. You can come visit us in Nashville. We're getting lots of sun these days.
Oh, fantastic.
Which I'd love to have you come visit. Maybe you can come and do a seminar or something like that for us at some point. That would be
Sounds great.
All right. It was so wonderful to meet you, and I can't wait to have you back on.
Thank you for a really an interesting conversation. We hit some things I've never spoken about before, so I appreciate that, Elizabeth.